More than other series I've covered on my page, I'm going to be working under the assumption that anyone watching is familiar with the show The Good Place, because it's a very difficult show to talk about without spoiling anything. But as a quick pitch for the uninitiated, Eleanor Shellstrop gets sent to the good place, essentially heaven, by mistake, but for fear of being sent to the bad place, she works to become a better person. She does this with the help of her soulmate, moral philosophy professor Chidi Anagonye, and other residents of her afterlife neighborhood, while trying to avoid detection from Michael, the neighborhood's architect. The show explores concepts of ethics and morality from a comedic slant and is generally a rip-roaring good time. If that sounds like it's up your alley, save this video and come back once you've watched the show. If you need a little more convincing, your official spoiler warning ends in 3, 2, 1. It's revealed at the end of the first season that the 4 main humans were actually in the bad place all along as guinea pigs for a brand new torture system devised by Michael as a twist on No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, a play that I'm pretending to have read in order to feel superior to you. The remainder of the series shifts its focus to a deconstruction of the entire afterlife system and the inherent flaws of eternal reward or eternal punishment, and is still generally a rip-roaring good time, which I will be breaking down one episode at a time for the next few months. I hope you'll join me, and always remember, everything is fine. The Good Place is a major deviation from showrunner Mike Schur's previous work on workplace comedies that more or less take place in the real world, so this is the first time he's had to do any substantial world building. You can still see the workplace comedy DNA in the expository dialogue, with Eleanor's introduction to the afterlife playing out like a job orientation, complete with the kind of corporate training video that anyone who's worked at a chain restaurant or a big box store will recognize immediately. And this framing helps to ground the more fantastical elements of the setting into experiences that are familiar to the audience. And the fact that this is more of a high-concept story than his previous shows gives Schur much more room to deceive the audience. Anything that could potentially set off alarm bells in a more savvy viewer can also be hand-waved as a quirk of the setting that shouldn't be taken too seriously. My favorite example from episode 1 is when Eleanor and Chidi are meeting people at the welcome party. Bombajan and Gloria are pretty extreme humanitarians, but their experiences are at least within the realm of reason for something a hardcore activist might do. But Sachvir giving both his kidneys to a perfect stranger is so impossibly selfless you have to ask, is this comedic hyperbole, an over-the-top capper to the rule of 3, or is it a hint that maybe something is off with some of the residents? And the fact that this dual explanation could be applied to so many things in the first season is key for making the ultimate reveal slap as hard as it does. Episode 2 sets up the standard formula for an episode of The Good Place. Step 1, Eleanor receives a basic primer on some ethical concept from Chidi and faces a related moral quandary. Step 2, Eleanor initially makes a positive choice, but then backslides when she faces resistance, typically to hilarious consequences. And Step 3, Eleanor follows through on doing the right thing, having fully internalized the moral of the episode. And as formulae go, this one is pretty solid. It makes the study and practice of moral philosophy accessible to kids of all ages and makes for a wide variety of situations in which to do comedy. Now, this kind of structure can risk coming off a bit preachy and condescending. Most people don't need reminding that it's bad to make other people clean up your messes, for example. But The Good Place largely avoids this, first by telling funny jokes. It is a sitcom after all, but secondly by really selling the progression of the characters. Eleanor starts the series as a believably bad person. She's definitely on the extreme end of realistic, but there is still a part of me that can relate to her brand of insensitive selfishness and wants to see her overcome it, as I hope to continue overcoming mine. So her waking up in the middle of the night out of guilt feels like a real victory, and even as she has a long way to go to reach the good place, it's enough to give me hope that it's possible. Standard writing advice dictates that conflict should come from your characters. Their personalities should contrast enough that they have different ideas on how to handle various situations, but complementary in a way that enables them to spur growth in each other. This is true for supporting characters like Chidi, who provides conflict for Eleanor by teaching her moral principles and assigning her ethical homework, and it's also true for more antagonistic characters like Tahani, who's the exact kind of public-facing do-gooder that preys on Eleanor's insecurities and forces her to confront her own shortcomings. And the fact that this is such standard writing advice means that the audience won't even find it particularly noteworthy that these characters almost seem like they were hand-selected to make each other's lives difficult, which brings me to my supplementary writing advice. If you're trying to trick your audience, consider what aspects of story structure or tropes of the genre they might be inclined to take for granted and use those to hide evidence of the twist in plain sight. Because the humans in The Good Place aren't just people that are well suited to causing each other problems, they're people who are perfectly suited to make each other miserable, and when you assume that it's just because they're well written is when you start to ignore all the other signs that you're being lied to. Before I ever watched the series, I was actually spoiled on the big twist of The Good Place by an article I randomly saw in passing whilst scrolling Facebook, so I wasn't actually that shocked when it happened. What I was completely unprepared for was the reveal of perhaps the greatest himbo in television history, Jason Mendoza. And I generally have an affinity for butt-of-the-joke type characters because when they're used correctly as Jason is, they can provide some of the most emotionally profound storytelling out there. The core joke of Jason's character is that others refuse to acknowledge his capabilities and contributions. Acid Cat only wanted Jason as a body double and had no interest in supporting him as a musician, and Chidi and Eleanor immediately started treating him like a liability once they found out his real identity. Even a step further, Michael really only picked Jason as a placeholder. He just needed somebody who would avoid Tahani and stay silent. Very little of Jason's actual personality was considered for how it would affect the others. All that mattered was the false identity Michael gave him. But in spite of this, Jason probably turned out to be the most important human for foiling Michael's plans as a truly unpredictable wildcard, even if the others never fully realized it. Basically, go Jags, Jacksonville forever. Not to say that I dislike Tahani's ultimate trajectory as a character, but to me she's really the most interesting part of Season 1 when you're working from the assumption that she does actually belong in The Good Place. Because what does it say about the afterlife system as a whole when a wealthy socialite heiress can effectively buy enough good person points to get to paradise regardless of how she actually is as a person? Plenty of the residents dedicated their lives to humanitarian work and are rewarded for their efforts, but the implication that they could have instead focused on increasing their material wealth by any means necessary and donating it before they died casts doubt on the idea that the good place is only reserved for people of the highest moral character. Could a billionaire business owner exploit their workers and inflate their stock value for 50 years, but offset all the suffering they caused in the eyes of the good place by paying other people to build a hospital in rural China or funding greenhouse gas reduction programs? If Tahani actually belongs in the good place, the answer is maybe, which is a clear bias in how immortal souls are judged. And though it ultimately turns out to be kind of a red herring, it's clear that there's something fundamentally wrong with the afterlife system, even if we're not meant to know at this point exactly what it is. Going off of what I talked about with Tahani, what does it say about The Good Place if we're meant to assume that Eleanor is actually the source of all the neighborhood's malfunctions? It says, for one, that the stability of the afterlife is incredibly fragile. It's presented as a perfect paradise, but one that can only be maintained if everybody follows the rules. Eat too many shrimp at a party, flying shrimp invade the sky the next morning. Destroy a cake that somebody spent a lot of time working on, giant sinkhole in the middle of the city. That even relatively minor faux pas or acts with mixed morality yield catastrophic results frames The Good Place as actually a very restrictive environment. Of course you would think that heaven should be free of even mundane cruelty, but where does the line get drawn? Is everybody expected to be maximally kind to each other 100% of the time for fear that hurting somebody's feelings, even accidentally, has outsized consequences? Or when you consider Jason, who never does anything actively cruel but causes Tahani to suffer through avoidance, why doesn't his inaction have the same impact as Eleanor's actions? Is ignoring obvious problems acceptable in the eyes of The Good Place? And if so, would the problems end if Eleanor just kept to herself for all of eternity, never doing anything wrong, but never owning up to her mistakes? And these are all questions that are answered by the twist, but if the story had been played straight, it would have still been fertile ground to question how we perceive morality and hold a mirror up to our own indifference. Janet really seems like it was the role of a lifetime, and Darcy Carden, who you may know as that one woman in that one song in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, go watch it, this is a threat, is really giving it her all in this episode, and every other episode where Janet is present. I just didn't want for that to go unspoken, because the main focus of this episode is Chidi. Up until now, he's been primarily a supporting presence in Eleanor's story, but this episode serves to round him out as a character and start exploring his own personal conflict that he has to overcome. Namely, being so preoccupied with what it means to do the right thing that you end up hurting people anyways, either through overly rigid adherence to moral codes or extreme indecision. And this is something that works as a moral conflict whether or not Chidi is supposed to be in the good place. If he is, then it means that the afterlife favors abstract philosophical positions over material impact of a person's actions. To be good is to think the right things, not to do them. But if he doesn't belong, then the afterlife system really only exists to punish people who can't intuitively determine their arbitrary definitions of right and wrong. And if you can't question those definitions without being punished, then the afterlife system is inherently tyrannical. And as we'll explore in the near future, what the afterlife considers right and wrong shows clear biases in the class of people who... Probably my biggest critique of The Good Place is its confused relationship to trashiness. When going through the questionnaire, really only the first question, have you committed any major crimes, represents a reasonable objection to belonging in The Good Place. The remainder of the criteria can best be described as gross or inconsiderate actions like microwaving fish or removing footwear on an airplane, or trashy actions like getting a vanity plate or tweeting about The Bachelor. And the fact that these are all criteria for deserving eternal torture according to the afterlife system is presented as a problem. Eleanor and Chidi reiterate in this episode that there really ought to be some kind of middle ground, but the show on the whole is still pretty mean-spirited and judgmental towards a lot of different behaviors. Maybe I'm just being sensitive because I enjoy the Red Hot Chili Peppers in moderation, but a lot of the offhand jokes about things that give negative afterlife points reveal major biases from the writers about what they think deserves to be shamed, and much of it is behavior heavily associated with poor, uneducated, or neurodivergent people. Obviously, the ultimate point of the series is that everybody deserves a real chance at paradise, but the amount of time something like having a themed wedding or liking the wrong sports team is uncritically made the butt of the joke is enough to leave a bad taste in my mouth when that same scorn could be directed at genuinely harmful behavior. The introduction of real Eleanor is definitely the point in the series where any reasonable doubts of Michael's honesty start to turn into outright suspicions, because even as the explanation might make sense in a vacuum, two people with the same name dying at the same place at the same time is bound to cause some confusion. It's an explanation that only works for the Eleanors, leaving a Jason-sized elephant in the room. Even if Michael doesn't know everything, he's clearly holding back some information, but at the same time as the mask is starting to slip, we get our first glimpse at the contradiction at the core of Michael's character. Michael thinks that the humans are so beneath him that he can give them misinformation without ever raising suspicions of his experiment, but it's that exact underestimation that causes his experiment to fail. And the fear he plays off as a Good Place architect's reasonable discomfort with demons is genuine in a sense. There's a part of him that already knows it's a matter of time before he's found out, so the lies have to keep getting bigger and more obvious. He knows that he can't afford to fail now if he's going to prove that there's a better way to run the afterlife, but it's getting outfoxed by the humans he thought were beneath his notice that makes him realize. The dissatisfaction he felt towards his job was just a reflection of the brokenness of the system as a whole. The love quadrangle of Chidi, Tahani, and the Eleanors feels like the most overt reference to No Exit, with the characters seeking and withholding affection being the source of their turmoil. And Jason's notable separation from this dynamic leads me to my personal theory that if it weren't for Jason, Michael might have succeeded in making the humans torture each other forever. Because in this episode, the love quadrangle is paralleled with Jason and Janet's wedding, with the former representing being tortured by the options you're given, and the latter finding happiness by creating your own options. The wedding does present some obvious problems to the humans, but here's the thing. They're different problems. The absurdity of the wedding snaps Eleanor and Tahani out of their feelings for Chidi, allowing the two of them to bond as real friends. This, in turn, gives Chidi an out from an impossible choice, freeing him to pursue a relationship with real Eleanor. And without Jason doing something that was not technically even a possibility, none of them would have gained the perspective necessary to overcome their former problems, and they would likely have continued to cause each other to suffer indefinitely. And that's the magic of Jason. He's so oblivious oblivious to the situations he finds himself in that he's the only one capable of making the best of a bad situation, or at least turning it into a different kind of bad that's easier to manage. Now that Eleanor is open about being a mistake in the good place, we get the first meaningful opportunity for her to display her ethical growth, as they attempt to calculate her new point total while in the afterlife. Central to the conflict of the calculations is the idea of impact versus intent, and the very culturally Christian idea that doing good deeds is worthless if your motivations are even partially selfish. And a corollary to this idea that goes unspoken is how heavily people conflate moral virtue with acceptance of suffering. In this situation, the corrupting selfishness of Eleanor's motivation is wanting to stay out of the bad place, implying that self-preservation, even when it doesn't cause any pain to others, is a moral deficit, and it's only by accepting cruel and disproportionate punishment that Eleanor proves her virtue. And this, to me, is the most important concept that the good place deconstructs, because so much of the injustice that exists in our society stems from the belief that suffering is compulsory, and any attempts to avoid it is shirking your social responsibility, when in fact it's the unjust social structures that create the suffering to justify and perpetuate their own existence. What the good place ultimately advocates is for us to move past that punitive mentality and build new systems that are free from unjust suffering. The medium place exemplifies many of the core issues of the afterlife system presented in the good place. First is the clear bias in giving those with access to vast financial resources the potential to at least partially buy their way into paradise, like I mentioned with Tahani. And I'm obviously not saying that charity is bad, but the fact that it seems to be graded by its absolute value and not relative to an individual's resources gives the wealthy an unfair advantage. Second, and more importantly, the question for Mindy wasn't whether charity is worth good place points, it was whether those points should be awarded posthumously. So the ultimate decision to create the medium place establishes that for the afterlife system, when there is any ambiguity in a person's point total, judgment favors the bad place. Because when you first see Mindy's house, it seems fine enough. It's not perfect, but she has food, entertainment, and relative freedom. But when you really think about it, everything goes sour quickly. The bad place can't torture Mindy, but they can make her eternal existence a bit of a bummer, taking the enjoyment away from every reward she was given. So the medium place might be better than the bad place, but eternal mediocrity in total isolation isn't a compromise. It's torture with the illusion of comfort. In publicly discussing a story whose reputation is largely defined by its big end of season 1 twist, I'm often reminded of the 2011 study which demonstrated that readers who received story spoilers enjoyed stories more than unspoiled readers, and the resulting public discourse around spoiler aversion. What many people, myself included, took away from the study is the belief that spoilers improve audience experience, full stop. And that's not inconsistent with the findings of the study, but it's at best a moot point, and at worst a justification for smugly spoiling stories for others against their will, which is cringe behavior that I regret immensely. A more useful takeaway from the study is in the form of writing advice. A twist in your story should improve the experience, not detract from it. I believe I've demonstrated with my analysis that season 1 of The Good Place without the twist is still a genuinely entertaining show, with funny jokes, strong character dynamics, and the potential for incisive social commentary. But the twist that everything up until now was just an elaborate torture chamber for the 4 humans takes the show from a 10 to an 8 out of 13. Because where a bad plot twist invalidates everything the characters went through, a good twist is just the final puzzle piece that gives the experience meaning.